The Hebrew scripture reading today is from the book of Esther, starting in chapter 7, verse 1. And we'll kind of take an abbreviated path through the chapter. The king and Haman were dining with Esther and drinking wine during the second dinner, when the king again said, "Esther, what can I do for you? Just ask, I'll give you as much as half of my kingdom." Esther answered, "Your Majesty, if you really care for me and are willing to help, you can save me and my people. That's what I really want, because a reward has been promised to anyone who kills my people. Your Majesty, if we were merely going to be sold as slaves, I would not have bothered you." "Well, who would dare to do such a thing?" the king asked. Esther replied, "That evil Haman is the one who set out to get us." Haman was terrified as he looked at the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the king's personal servants, said, "Your Majesty, Haman built a tower 75 feet high beside his house so he could hang Mordecai. And Mordecai is the very one who spoke out and saved your life." "Hang Haman on his own tower," the king commanded. Right away, Haman was hanged on the tower he had built to kill Mordecai, and the king calmed down. Mordecai wrote down everything that had happened. Then he sent letters to Jewish people everywhere in the provinces and told them, "Each year you must celebrate on both the 14th and the 15th of Adar, the days when we Jews defeated our enemies. Remember this month as a time when our sorrow turned to joy and celebration took place in the place of crying. Celebrate by having parties and giving the poor and sharing gifts of food with each other." My reflection is titled Queen Esther and the Orange Shirt. The book of Esther does not mention God, prayer, or covenant. There's not even much theology in Esther. The lack of religious behavior may have reduced the book's popularity some. J.G. McConville wrote the Daily Study Bible commentary on Esther. McConville notes to the effect that Esther does not mention God, does not discuss theology, but that does not mean that the book does not teach about God. There are times when the Bible is political. Esther is political, making the power people in the Persian Empire look very bad. Subplots in Esther mock the Persian court and king. The thinly disguised insults were probably enjoyed by a lot of ancient Israelites who listened to the story of Queen Esther. J.G. McConville says, "The book of Esther is by any standards a brilliantly written story." Commentator William McNeill says, "There's a sense in the book of Esther that it really might not be historical, but it contains enough history to feel realistic." There's enough drama and nationalism in Esther to appeal to the children of Israel. Contributors to the New American Bible state the purpose of Esther is glorification of the Jewish people. One theologian considers the book of Esther to be a short novel, a novella, about Jewish people living away from their home. While I'm very uncomfortable with high levels of nationalism, members of oppressed minority groups need high levels of self-worth to thrive in the face of oppression. The Bible is a book for the oppressed, for all the oppressed. As we remember Orange Shirt Day, I'm going to say that again. The Bible is a book for all oppressed people. I'm not going to tell Indigenous people what the story of Esther means to them. I'm going to share what the story means to me. The Israelites were carried off into slavery in other nations and they faced oppression. The passage in the book of Esther is about an extreme act of oppression, an attempt to kill all Jewish people. We study this story on a day when we remember the oppression of indigenous children who attended boarding schools. The Canadian Encyclopedia says an estimated 6,000 children died at residential Canadian schools. The school day for Indigenous children started about 5:30 in the morning when children were expected to get up. Students were malnourished and vulnerable to tuberculosis and influenza. Teachers were generally poorly qualified and students developed either the skills to return to their own communities and be very successful or the skills to be able to compete well in a larger workforce. Students, parents, and others protested the schools. A few students stole food, ran away, or set fires. Parents and political leaders protested the harsh conditions. The students, parents, and political leaders who acted out and who protested strike me as the heroes of the Indigenous residential school era. The impact of these policies that oppressed Indigenous peoples continue to this day. While Canadians of non-Indigenous background may think, gee, that took place a long time ago, why are we talking about it? Indigenous people see the impact of the residential schools on the lives of their extended families every single day. One way that non-Indigenous people can recognize the inherent God-given dignity of Indigenous people is to listen to those stories with a sensitive heart. I see that as a spiritual calling, not as a political statement. Jewish people around the world remember the story of Queen Esther, her courageous coming out and the salvation of Jewish people from the plan to kill all Jewish people. The holiday Purim means lots because Haman drew lots to see what day Jewish people should be killed. If we were to name the story now, we might call it lottery. Wang Wei Ching Angela is a theologian. She was teaching at the Christian University of Hong Kong when she wrote a short commentary on the book of Esther. She makes the point that people living in Hong Kong are divided between competing sets of values, Western values, and traditional Chinese values. Those living in Hong Kong are kind of like Jewish people living in Persia, living with the tension between being under a colonial power, Persia, and being Jewish. Or in Hong Kong, living under the colonial power of Britain by background and heritage and being Chinese and now living as a part of China. Indigenous people live with the tension of living as Canadians and having Indigenous identity. While Canada is not an imperialist colonial power, some of Canada's approaches and institutions for First Nations people were developed when Canada was a colony. A few of the policies implemented regarding Indigenous people reflect Canada's colonial past. Some members of minority groups living in Canada may be able to relate to the story of Esther and to the injustice Esther's people faced. The timing of Purim, a day when Jewish people celebrate the story of Esther, remains meaningful. Joseph Stalin was a ruthless dictator in the Soviet Union. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of innocent people. He is believed to have had bloody plans to solve what he saw as a Jewish problem in the Soviet Union. In 1953, when the situation was seen to be in crisis, Joseph Stalin died. He died on Purim. Some of you might remember the 1990s Gulf War. It took place after Iraq invaded Kuwait. For months, Saddam Hussein, Iraq's president, threatened to use Scud missiles on Israel. Scud missiles containing chemical gases that he said would burn half of Israel. I suspect many Israelis braced themselves for the absolute worst. According to Wikipedia Encyclopedia, 3 Israelis were killed by missiles and about 71 additional Israelis died as an indirect result of the missiles. So fortunately, Israel didn't suffer huge loss of life. The conflict ended on Purim Day. The book of Esther is a story of fears and threats and courage, coming out, salvation, celebration. After a competition, Esther, this beautiful Jewish woman, becomes the new queen of Persia. Esther's identity isn't well known, though. Jewish people have fallen out of power with some of the important people in Persia. Haman was an important official in Persia, so important that people were supposed to bow to him. Mordecai, a well-known Jewish man, refused to kneel or bow to Haman. Mordecai explained he did not kneel because he was Jewish. When Haman learned this, he wanted all Jewish people killed. All Jewish people killed. Mordecai learned of the plan to kill all Jewish people. He puts on sackcloth and mourned. Queen Esther was a closeted Jewish woman, and she's notified about this plot. She's asked by Mordecai to appeal to the king to save her people. Her first step is to go to the king and invite the king and Haman to a dinner. At that dinner, she invites them to a second dinner. And that's where we pick up the story in today's lectionary reading. As you might be able to understand the sense of poetic justice or karma in the narrative, because Haman had gallows built specifically to kill Mordecai, and Haman is hanged on the gallows he built for Mordecai. While a quick read of Esther may give us a sense that there's nothing particularly spiritual or religious in the book, Esther speaks volumes about the love of God and God's priorities. The fact that Esther builds up the morale and self-esteem of oppressed people says a world about God. As a people of faith, we have a holy and sacred duty to encourage and build up people who face systemic oppression. The story of Esther takes place after a disaster. Because the people were displaced and enslaved by war, the children of Israel were living in Persia, at least many of them were. Orange Shirt Day is a reality only because of a disaster, of a policy, of having boarding schools to teach indigenous children. And we are in a disaster that is called the pandemic during times of personal pain that may blot out the word God and prayer in the narratives of our hearts. Purim speaks to us. I'm going to conclude with a quote from Rabbi Manis Freedom as he reflects on the meaning of Purim. God became real enough that we don't have to refer to him to know that he's there. The real achievement is that God became real to us. Our relationship has gotten stronger after destruction, not weaker.